It was May 25th, 1995, when the maid of Fran Griega, a Hungarian millionaire, arrived at her work at the mansion located in the town of Golden Beach in Florida, United States. Upon entering the house, he noticed something extremely strange. The pet was alone, and its owner had not left him water or food. This behavior was not common for him or his partner, so he finally began to look for them. The maid decided to report the disappearance to the police and alert the Hungarian community in the area. That same day, an acquaintance of the couple saw the yellow Lamborghini that belonged to the missing, circulating through the streets. The driver was not his friend, but a Cuban man. In the next vehicle, a Mercedes, was traveling another subject, who he quickly recognized was called Daniel Hugo and had tried to do business with Griega. Just a few days ago, the man alerted 911 without knowing that they were about to discover a dangerous gang of kidnappers that already had more than one victim under their belt, including a powerful businessman. Mark Schiller was born in August 1957 in the city of Buenos Aires, Argentina. When he was only 7 years old, he moved with his parents to Brooklyn County in New York, United States, on the other side of the continent. His childhood and adolescence passed in complete tranquility when he reached adulthood. He studied a bachelor's degree in accounting and a master's degree in business administration after graduation. He traveled to Colombia to work in an American-funded oil company and settled in Bogota, the country's capital. There he met his wife, Diana. Soon they married and had 2 children. In 1989, Schiller returned to the United States with his family and settled in Miami, where he opened his own accounting firm. As he was an expert in finance, the business quickly amassed a fortune. He soon acquired a franchise of a chain specializing in sandwiches and made even more money. Everything went extremely well until 1991, when something happened that could have been another event in his life, but ended up being everything. Her personal secretary, Linda, told her about her husband, Jorge Delgado, a Cuban born in Havana. The man was unemployed, and that was shaking the economy of the house. Quite dismayed Linda, I asked Schiller if I could hire him. After hesitating a little, he accepted without knowing that he was changing the course of his own history. Since Delgado joined the company, both men entered into an extreme relationship of trust, so much so that after a few months they started doing business together, such as acquiring a nutritional supplement company. But not everything was business for the Cuban. In his free time, Delgado dedicated himself to taking care of his health and muscles at the Sun Gym, located in the Miami Lakes area, a town in Miami County, Dade, about 25 kilometers north of downtown. There, he had an excellent relationship with everyone, from regular athletes to employees. One of the latter was Daniel Hugo, an ex-con who had pleaded guilty to scams worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and had already paid for his crime. Between the typical routines, both became confidants, which is why Delgado did not hesitate to try to add him to the personal relationship he maintained with Schiller. But the presence of this third person did not please the magnate at all. She quickly learned about his criminal past and refused to hire him further. He advised Delgado to stay away from that man, since he did not seem trustworthy and believed that he would bring him many problems. He disobeyed his boss, continued to secretly attend the Songjin, and converse with this man about possible business. Eventually, Schiller found out, and his attitude was totally blunt. First, he removed Delgado from the companies they held together, and paid him the part of the society that corresponded to him later. He closed the rest of the businesses they had together and wished him good luck. Finally, she cut him out of her life, refused to see him, even as a friend. It would not be long before the consequences of these clearly correct decisions would see the light. Delgado told him everything that happened to Lujo, who convinced him that he should take revenge on his former boss. The proposal was as simple as it was sinister. Together, they would kidnap him, and they'd take away his entire fortune. The man, who apparently was easy to convince, agreed, and they began to draw up the macabre plan. To carry it out, they recruited 3 other bodybuilders, who also trained in Sojin, Adrian, Durbal, Stevenson, Pierre, and Carwicks, to persuade them. Then he told them a lie. He said Schiller had swindled Delgado out of over $200,000. In exchange for participating in the kidnapping for 2 days, I would give them a payment of $100,000. All 3 men agreed. This is how the band of bodybuilders was formed. The next step was to attack, but this would not be so easy. The first plan was to dress up as ninjas on Halloween night and knock on Schiller's door asking for candy, though. Some unexpected twist ended the night at a strip club. Then they chose to dress in black and military camouflage, so they would crawl through the businessman's garden with the aim of catching him when he picked up the newspaper at the time when the paperboy left it at his door. But when the day came, a car passed several times through a neighboring street, which frightened them and led them to abort the mission. None of that made the band give up. Shortly thereafter, they tried to board Schiller in the middle of the Palmetto Highway as he stepped off it to face the road home. But they took the wrong exit, and on top of that, their victim took an unexpected descent a couple of kilometers before where they expected him. Already more frustrated, they tried to kidnap him outside a pet store, where he was buying food for his dogs, however. One of the vehicles in which they were traveling suffered damage and had to be repaired at the door of the store. Schiller left a few minutes later and returned to his house, not suspecting that these guys, leaning over the hood of a car, were after him. Finally, after this series of misfortunes that revealed the lack of planning ability of the command group, they achieved their objective. On 15th of November 1994, the 5th kidnapping attempt took place. It was 4 p.m. in the autumn afternoon when the kidnappers waited for Schiller at the door of his restaurant. When he went out to the deciliter, the gang stunned him with a taser gun, covered his face, hooded him, handcuffed him, and loaded him into a van to head to a Delgado depot in Gilia, another city in Edith County. Schiller thought it was a simple robbery. He tried to calm the situation. "Take my watch, my wallet, my car that you want most," inquired the businessman. "You?" That was the response of his captors. In the shed, the victim was subjected to all kinds of humiliation, given electric shocks, beaten, whipped, and even burned with a lighter, which would be a 2-day abduction. It lasted for about a month, during which Schiller had his eyes covered with duct tape the entire time, suffering severe blindness to calm him down. He was provided with sleeping pills and alcohol in large quantities, and as if this were not enough, the abuse began to escalate. The band of bodybuilders even performed execution drills with him playing Russian roulette on his 100th at the time. The businessman mentally referred to the warehouse as the hotel from hell. Because food was scarce, he lost more than 20 kilo. When they ran out of ideas for physical torments, the psychological ones arrived. The gang began threatening to abuse his wife and murder his son and daughter, who were 6 and 2 years old respectively. "How come you have so much money and neither do we?" he was asked daily. After many days, the businessman decided to make a deal with them. He would transfer all his assets to them if they would leave his family alone. Lugo and his henchmen agreed and allowed him to call his wife, whom he told to travel to her native Colombia while he finished closing some businesses. Diana did not worry about her husband's request. In fact, he never reported her missing, and obeyed her orders without question for the next few days. Schiller blindly signed dozens of documents, which were notarized by John, my owner of Soon Jim, whom he later hired to be the new manager of the company, which would become the band. The same happened with housing and with bank accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, in which the businessman kept nearly $1.25 million in investments. They were emptied by the band, who transferred that money to tax havens. Thanks to this series of concessions, Schiller seemed to have bought his ticket back to normal life, until he talked too much. As delays in paperwork and transfer procedures delayed his release, the businessman realized that one of his captors' voices sounded extremely familiar to him. It was this man. That she had tried to do business with him. But not only did he recognize Lux's voice, he also began to imagine who might have a reason to carry out the kidnapping. And quickly, Delgado's name popped into his mind. However, the businessman's real mistake was not identifying his former friend, but saying out loud that he had discovered him. Upon finding out, his captors decided there was no turning back. I knew too much, and leaving him alive wasn't an option. From then on, they began to consider different ways to kill him. Thus arrived on December 10th that Schiller signed the last transaction, a life insurance for $2,000. On behalf of Lugo's wife, Lilian Torres, he also contacted his lawyer to tell him that his wife had discovered an affair with a Cuban, which justified this latest bank move. By that time, the businessman had been deprived of his freedom for 25 days, and no one seemed to suspect his absence. With everything ready, the kidnappers prepared to take his life. One of them suggested suffocating him and throwing him into the river in a vehicle to collect insurance. But Lugo refused. Since the appearance of the body could take weeks, it had to be something quick, and it won't wake up. Suspicions thus defined that the businessman, he would be the victim of an unfortunate car accident. During the following days, he was forced to drink alcohol and sleeping pills in large quantities. At 2:30 a.m. on December 15th, Lugo, Wicks and Darval took him out of the Hotel del Infierno, completely stunned, and put him in his far runner. Then they drove into the shopping district and parked just 3 blocks from the sandwich place that used to belong to him. Once there, Lugo strapped Schiller to the driver's seat and sat down beside him. Then he stepped on the accelerator and jumped before the vehicle crashed into a concrete pillar. Against all odds, as they approached, they noticed that Schiller was still alive, although he was unconscious. Lugo took a can of fuel. I sprayed the businessman's body and the truck then ignited it, hoping that the explosion of the propane tank placed inside will finish off the businessman and erase some of his tracks. But their plans failed again as they walked away from the scene. In the backup car, the kidnappers turned failed killers saw Schiller open the door and get out of the burning van. Wicks, who was driving the backup car, was for the 3rd assassination attempt. In less than half an hour, after a brief and slow chase, he managed to ram the businessman whose body was still staggering, hit the hood, and ran out of doubts. Luis turned and ran over him again to make sure Chile was really dead. Then he tried to do it again, but the headlights of a nearby car frightened him and he changed course, escaping at full speed nonetheless. By then they were sure they had accomplished their task, but they were very wrong. On December 16, Chile was admitted to Jackson Memorial Hospital in a coma as 1NN, as police were unable to identify him. There he underwent several surgeries. They removed his vessel, patched his bladder, and eventually reconstructed his hip with nails and hooks. The businessman woke up and even regained speech. However, he avoided telling what had happened to him, since months earlier, he had been in the sights of the forces for alleged scams linked to a social security program administered by the US government. I thought the fact that he disappeared for a month and reappeared badly injured, saying that a gang of bodybuilders kidnapped him and took his entire fortune, would be hard to believe. It might even look like a choking slap to save yourself from condemnation. Dismayed, Schiller decided to contact through a lawyer Eduboa, a former FBI agent who headed Investigairos Inc., Florida's oldest private detective agency. His goal was to gather enough evidence of what had happened to him to then turn to the police. Dubois did not firmly believe his story, but in the face of doubt, he chose to advise him to leave the hospital and, if possible, the city of Miami, since if his alleged kidnappers discovered that he was still alive, they would try to murder him again. Meanwhile, Lugo and his gang scanned the Miami media every day, waiting for mention of the appearance of a lifeless body next to a burning truck. But that never happened. Anxiously, they called the morgue, and they contacted various hospitals to inquire about Schiller without success. Finally, upon leaving one of his many operating rooms, while he was under the influence of an anesthetic, the businessman ended up revealing the truth. Obviously, the police didn't believe him, but they didn't arrest him either. And that same day, his name appeared in the newspapers, and the band of bodybuilders knew he was still alive. Upon learning that their prisoner was admitted to the GMEH, they decided to visit the hospital. Once there, they got lost in the huge hallways and failed to find the intensive care area. But they didn't give up. Together, they reviewed the layout of the hospital and bought clothes to pose as doctors. The next day, they made a prior call, consulting the businessman's condition at that moment. They received an answer that left them speechless. Schiller was no longer hospitalized. It had slipped out of his sight again. On December 17th, the businessman left the care center despite the fact that professionals recommended that he rest. He boarded a private medical plane at the cost of $6,000 heading to New York. Once there, he spent the next few days recovering at Staten Island University Hospital. On December 24th, he was discharged and moved to his sister's house on Long Island. Shortly afterwards, he flew to Colombia. In the meantime, he continued to gather information and send it to Detective Dubois, who by now had given him his vote of confidence. In early January 1995, Schiller discovered the havoc his captors had wrought. His house no longer belonged to his sandwich franchise. It had been dissolved. His offshore accounts and checking account were empty, and his credit cards contained $80,000 in expenses, including condoms, adult films, and artificial items intended for intimate pleasure. He began to think that his captors had abandoned the idea of murdering him, and that they only wanted to devote themselves to enjoying the spoils. And so it was. The band of bodybuilders was in Miami in a state of complete tranquility. They assumed that, because a considerable amount of time had passed, Schiller had either died or had decided not to turn to the police. There was nothing to worry about. So Lugo created D&J International, a Bahamian firm, and settled in the businessman's mansion by then. It was already his property in the safe. He found $10,000 in cash, credit cards, insurance policies, and Schiller's wife's jewelry. But far from behaving like a criminal, he decided to make use of his acting skills and deceive the neighbors. He introduced himself as Tom, a supposed member of the United States Security Forces. He told them that the businessman had had legal problems, and that he had been deported to Colombia with his family. In addition, he told them that the house had been confiscated by the government and that both he and his companions would take care of its maintenance. Darval was also located in the area, more precisely 1 block from Lugo. Everyone in the band let their guard down, completely unaware that Schiller was onto something. The businessman flew from Colombia to the United States, specifically to Miami, to meet with Dubois. Together they went to the police to present the evidence collected about the kidnapping and extortion that Schiller had experienced. That a large number of hours declaring. But this did not have the expected effect, as he mentioned that part of the stolen money belonged to Colombian relatives of his wife, the federal forces. It didn't take long for them to think it was a drug trafficking case. They didn't want to get involved. After a couple of days, the troops contacted Dubois to give him the bad news. Even though it was a case that included kidnapping, torture, conspiracy, and attempted murder, they were going to paint it as a simple robbery. This could result in the criminal gang going free and trying to murder Schiller again, however. The reality is that by then Lugo and his henchmen were running out of money and already had another victim in their sights. Through Darval, the group reached Fran Griega, a Hungarian businessman who had become a millionaire with telephone privacy lines. He had a luxury car collection, a yacht, and a $700,000 mansion, enough for the gang to live upstairs for a while longer. On Saturday, May 20th, Lugo and Dorva arrived at Griega's home located in Golden Beach, posing as cousins. He was offered to invest in a telecommunications company in which he was supposedly doing well, so much so that it was expanding into India. The act included graphic cake brochures and slides, which made it believable, although clearly a big lie after consulting the offer with a stockbroker. Briga agreed to arrange a second meeting with its possible new partners. The meeting was on May 25th at Darwal's house. The businessman arrived with his girlfriend, Christina Fortin, who stayed watching television with Lugo, while his partner and the host retired to talk business in his room. Within minutes, the woman began to hear atrocious screams and ran to meet her husband, whom she found covered in Darwal blood. He ignored Fortin's presence and began to suffocate Griega, then delivered a fatal blow to her head. As the woman wept, completely immobilized by Lugo, Dorband gave her a dose. They break a powerful sedative used on horses and large animals. The plan was coming out as expected. Griega was lifeless, and one had been taken out of $1. They quickly decided that when Fortin woke up, they would threaten her to provide the mansion's security codes, and that's what they did. When the woman regained consciousness, they pressured her to provide information about the businessman's assets, accounts, credit cards, security codes, and destination of his cash. But Carlton only cried for help. In a complete state of panic, they drugged her again, which led to her death from an overdose. The crime culminated without any gain, and with the gang having to perform a new task, get rid of the bodies. For this, Darvel rented a truck, with which they moved the bodies to the same warehouse where Schaller had been kidnapped. Once there, they prepared to dismember them with their chainsaw. But the machine jammed with Fortun's long hair, and they had to resort to axes. At the end of the ruthless task, they placed the remains of the couple in 2 large barrels without hands, feet, or teeth to prevent them from being identified. Then they loaded the drums into the truck and drove southwest Miami to dump them in a drain. Morning fell, and Griega's maid arrived at the mansion to begin a new working day. There, he discovered the couple's dog alone inside, which caught his attention. The businessman and his girlfriend treated the pet like a son, so it was impossible for them to leave it abandoned and without food. Quickly, the lady notified the couple's friends and the Hungarian community of the city. He then went to the police to file a missing persons report, ignoring that he was about to participate in the capture of the dangerous gang just a few hours later. One of Griega's acquaintances saw her vehicle, a yellow Lamborghini, driving through the streets. Since he knew of his absence, I suspect he was the one who handled it, which is why he followed him. Once his car was at the same height, he discovered that the person driving it was not his friend, but Jorge Delgado. In addition, I noticed that there was a Mercedes next to the vehicle, and that Luxo was behind the wheel, who he had met once at the victim's house. This subject did not hesitate to call 911 to narrate what he had seen, and finally the authorities gave the case the attention it deserved. Captain Al Harper remembered Schiller's story and quickly telephoned Dubois to discuss the similarities between the two crimes together. The criminal's modus operandi was evident. It was modeled after the case that the businessman narrated months ago. Within just a few hours, arrest warrants were issued, and both Darwal and Delgado were arrested at their homes. Lugo was only found 5 days later in the Bahamas with his girlfriend Sabina Petrescu, a Romanian erotic dancer whom he had met in a nightclub when his plane landed in Miami. He saw the police deployment waiting for him and only managed to say between laughs, "All this is for me and it will be." The trial against the Sun Yinhang, as the American press called them, began on February 24, 1998, almost 3 years after the arrests. It was the longest and most expensive in Edith County history. Over 10 weeks, the prosecution and jury analyzed more than 1,200 pieces of physical evidence. 22 search warrants were issued, 10,000 pieces of evidence were presented, and they heard the testimony of 98 witnesses, including Schiller's. Lugo also took the stand to detail the location of the bodies of Griega and her partner. The serial number on Forton's breast implants allowed identification. After that, the gang leader did not make any further contributions to the case after the jury discussed the sentence for the defendants for 4 months. The day of truth has come. On 17th of July 1998, Judge Alex Ferrer sentenced Lugo, whom he considered the mastermind of the crime, and Dorman, who perpetrated the murders, next to him, to capital punishment. Delgado was lucky on the one hand because Schiller declared him harmless, and on the other, because it could not be proven that he had actively participated in the murders. In addition, he testified against his former accomplices, which resulted in a 13-year sentence that set him free. November 2002, John Miss, the owner of Sumjin, was sentenced to 30 years and died in prison in 2004. The rest of the defendants received lesser sentences during the following years. Lugo and Darval appealed to the court not to carry out the death penalty. Although this was denied to them, they still remain on death row. Without a set date for its execution, paradoxically, Schiller didn't have an ideal ending either. In February 1999, he pleaded guilty to fraud related to the medical system and was sentenced to 46 months APOS, imprisonment on 17th March 1999. After leaving prison, the former businessman moved to Boca Raton and wrote 2 books, but even there, he did not find peace. This was due to that in 2013, his story came to Hollywood with the film Blood, Sweat and Glory, directed by Michael Bay, and starring Mark Wahlberg and Dwayne Johnson The Rock. It did not use the real names of either the criminals or Schiller. However, the problem was not with the exposure itself, but because, according to him, the tape was based on articles that journalist Pete Collins wrote